Sarah Chin never imagined that her steady hands, trained only to count ammunition and log supply requests, would one day save the lives of an entire ranger unit. In the remote mountains of Afghanistan, where the thin air carries both prayers and gunfire, she was known as the quiet woman who always made sure the coffee was hot and the medical supplies were stocked. But when the radio crackled with desperate voices calling for help, and 11 enemy fighters had her fellow soldiers pinned down in a killing field, Sarah would discover that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are forged not in training camps, but in the split second when everything you thought you knew about yourself shatters like glass. This is the story of how a supply coordinator became a legend with 11 perfect shots that echoed through the mountains and changed everything. Sarah Chun had always been the type of person who preferred spreadsheets to spotlights. At 26, she possessed the kind of quiet efficiency that made her invaluable but invisible. Her colleagues at the Forward Operating Base in the Kunar province of Afghanistan knew her as the woman who could locate any piece of equipment in under 5 minutes, who remembered which soldiers preferred extra sugar in their coffee, and who somehow managed to keep morale high even when supply drops were delayed for weeks. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Sarah woke at 0500 hours in her small quarters, a converted shipping container that she had made surprisingly comfortable with photos of her family's restaurant in San Francisco and a small collection of books her mother sent in care packages. The books were mostly romance novels, which seemed absurd in this harsh landscape of brown mountains and constant tension, but they reminded her of home and the life she planned to return to after her deployment. She had joined the army not out of patriotic fervor or a desire for adventure, but because her family's restaurant was struggling, and the military promised steady pay and benefits. Her parents, immigrants from Taiwan who had built their American dream one dim sum order at a time, didn't understand why their academically gifted daughter chose the military over graduate school. But Sarah understood numbers, and the numbers said this was the fastest way to help her family while figuring out her own future. Her role as a supply coordinator meant she spent her days managing inventory, coordinating with transport units, and ensuring that everything from toilet paper to ammunition reached the soldiers who needed it. It was detail-oriented work that suited her personality perfectly. She took pride in her efficiency, in the way she could track hundreds of items across multiple units, and somehow make the chaos of military logistics seem organized. The base where Sarah worked was strategically positioned in a valley that served as a crucial supply route. It wasn't the largest installation, housing only about 200 personnel, but its location made it vital for operations throughout the region. The mountains surrounding them were beautiful in an austere way, their peaks reaching toward a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. But those same mountains also provided perfect cover for insurgent activities, making every day a careful balance between routine and vigilance. Sarah's closest friend at the base was Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, a communications officer from Texas who shared her love of terrible jokes and her homesickness. Marcus had been assigned to the base 6 months before Sarah arrived, and he had taken it upon himself to help the newcomers adjust to the isolation and stress of deployment. He was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, organized movie nights in the recreation tent, and somehow maintained an optimistic outlook despite the constant underlying tension of their situation. The relationship between Sarah and Marcus was complicated in the way that many military friendships were. The proximity, shared stress, and isolation created bonds that felt deeper than civilian friendships, but were constrained by military protocol and the knowledge that deployment would eventually end. They spent hours talking about their lives before the army, their plans for after deployment, and their observations about their fellow soldiers. Marcus often joked that Sarah saw everything but said little, making her the unofficial keeper of base secrets and gossip. Another important figure in Sarah's daily life was Sergeant First Class Janet Williams, the NCO who supervised the supply operations. Williams was a 20-year veteran who had seen deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and she ran her department with a combination of maternal care and military precision. She had taken Sarah under her wing from day one, teaching her not just the technical aspects of supply management, but the interpersonal skills needed to work effectively with soldiers who were often stressed, homesick, and dealing with the daily reality of being in a combat zone. Williams had noticed something about Sarah that others missed. While most people saw a quiet, efficient clerk, Williams recognized that Sarah possessed an unusual ability to remain calm under pressure and to think clearly when others were panicking. She had seen this quality during supply emergencies, when critical equipment was delayed or damaged, and Sarah would methodically work through solutions while others were still processing the problem. Williams made mental notes about these observations, though she never imagined they would prove relevant outside the supply depot. The base's military operations were primarily focused on securing the surrounding area and supporting smaller outposts scattered throughout the mountains. These outposts served as early warning systems and staging areas for patrols, but they were isolated and vulnerable. The soldiers stationed at these remote locations depended entirely on regular supply runs and communication with the main base for their survival and effectiveness. One of the most challenging aspects of operations in the region was the terrain itself. The mountains were not only physically demanding, but also provided countless hiding places for insurgent forces. Supply convoys had to navigate narrow, winding roads that were perfect for ambushes. Helicopter supply drops were often the safer option, but were weather-dependent and required careful coordination. Sarah had become expert at juggling these logistics, understanding wind patterns, fuel requirements, and load capacities as well as any pilot. The routine of base life provided a comforting structure amid the uncertainty of deployment. Sarah would begin each day by reviewing supply requests that had come in overnight, checking inventory levels, and coordinating with transport units. She would walk through the storage areas, physically verifying counts and conditions of critical items. Her attention to detail had prevented several potentially dangerous shortages, earning her recognition from the base commander and respect from the soldiers who depended on her work. Despite the serious nature of her responsibilities, Sarah found moments of joy and connection in her daily interactions. She knew which soldiers were counting days until they could return home, which ones were worried about family situations back home, and which ones used humor to mask their anxiety. She became skilled at reading the subtle signs of stress and would quietly ensure that soldiers who were struggling received priority for care packages or special items that might boost their morale. The weapons training that all soldiers received had been, for Sarah, just another requirement to complete. She had qualified with her sidearm and rifle, meeting the minimum standards required for deployment, but she had never considered herself particularly skilled with firearms. The training had been conducted on flat ranges with paper targets, very different from the mountainous terrain surrounding their base. Like most soldiers in support roles, she carried her weapon but expected never to use it in actual combat. However, what Sarah didn't realize was that her natural steady hands and attention to detail, qualities that made her excellent at inventory management, also translated well to marksmanship when combined with proper training. Her instructors had noted her consistent accuracy during qualification, but in the context of minimum requirements, this hadn't seemed particularly significant. Sarah herself thought of her weapon as another piece of equipment to maintain and carry, not as a tool she might actually need to use. The psychological aspects of deployment affected everyone differently. Some soldiers thrived on the adrenaline and sense of purpose, others struggled with the separation from family and the constant low-level stress. Sarah fell somewhere in between. She missed home deeply, especially her parents and the familiar rhythms of working in the family restaurant. But she had adapted well to military life. Her natural inclination toward organization and service made her a good fit for her role, and she had developed genuine friendships with her colleagues. As her deployment progressed, Sarah had begun to feel more confident in her abilities and her place within the unit. She had successfully managed several challenging logistics situations, had earned the trust of both her superiors and the soldiers she served, and had developed a routine that made the time pass more quickly. She had started planning for her return home, thinking about how she might use her military experience and the money she had saved to help expand her family's restaurant or perhaps pursue further education. The base's location meant that they regularly received updates about insurgent activity in the surrounding area. Intelligence reports indicated increasing movement and coordination among hostile forces, but this was not unusual for the region. Sarah, like most soldiers in support roles, was aware of these reports but didn't focus on them extensively. Her job was to ensure that the soldiers who dealt directly with these threats had everything they needed to do their jobs effectively. Communication with the outside world was limited but precious. Sarah wrote regular emails to her family, though she couldn't share details about her location or activities for security reasons. Her parents' messages were filled with news about the restaurant, updates about extended family, and gentle encouragement to stay safe. Her mother always included recipes in her emails, as if Sarah might suddenly have access to fresh ingredients and a proper kitchen in the Afghan mountains. The friendships Sarah had developed at the base were unlike any relationships she had experienced in civilian life. The shared experience of deployment, the isolation from normal life, and the underlying awareness of danger created bonds that formed quickly and ran deep. She found herself caring about these people in ways that surprised her, feeling protective of their well-being and invested in their success and safety. As the weeks passed, Sarah had begun to notice changes in the routine and atmosphere of the base. There were more frequent patrols, additional security measures, and a subtle increase in tension that seemed to affect everyone. The intelligence reports were indicating heightened threat levels, and the base commander had implemented additional precautions. For Sarah, this meant ensuring that weapons and ammunition were readily available, that medical supplies were fully stocked, and that communication equipment was functioning perfectly. The soldiers who went out on patrol had become more serious in their demeanor, and Sarah noticed that they were more careful about checking their equipment and confirming supply requirements. She made sure that their requests were processed immediately and that they had everything they needed before leaving the relative safety of the base. These interactions had taken on new weight as she realized how much these soldiers depended on her attention to detail for their safety and effectiveness. Despite the increasing tension, life on the base continued with its established routines. Sarah still managed her spreadsheets, still ensured that coffee was available in the command center, and still found time for conversations with Marcus and the other soldiers she had come to consider family. But there was an underlying current of anticipation, a sense that something significant was building in the mountains around them. The first indication that this day would be different came at 1,347 hours when the regular afternoon radio check-in from Outpost Delta was 15 minutes late. Sarah was cataloging medical supplies when she heard Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice become slightly sharper as he attempted to raise the remote station. In the world of military communications, 15 minutes wasn't necessarily cause for alarm, but it was enough to draw attention from those who understood the importance of maintaining precise schedules in hostile territory. Outpost Delta was one of the smaller installations that depended on Sarah's base for regular supply runs. Positioned on a ridge 12 kilometers northeast of their location, it served as an early warning post and patrol base for 6 rangers who rotated in and out on 2-week assignments. The outpost was strategically important because it provided oversight of a valley that insurgents frequently used as a movement corridor. The soldiers stationed there were experienced rangers, handpicked for their ability to operate independently in challenging conditions. Sarah knew the Delta team well because she had personally prepared their supply packages for the past 3 months. Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson led the team, a quiet professional from Montana who had been deployed 4 times and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble before it materialized. Corporal David Kim was the team's communications specialist, a tech-savvy soldier from California who could repair almost any piece of electronic equipment with whatever materials happened to be available. The other team members were equally skilled, representing the kind of small unit expertise that made such remote operations possible. The supply relationship between Sarah's base and Outpost Delta had developed its own rhythm over the months. Every Monday and Thursday, a helicopter would deliver food, water, ammunition, and any special items the Rangers had requested. Sarah took particular care with these deliveries because she understood that these 6 men were completely dependent on her accuracy and attention to detail. A mistake in medical supplies or communication equipment could have life-threatening consequences for soldiers who were hours away from backup. Beyond the routine supplies, Sarah had developed a personal interest in making sure the Delta team received small comfort items that helped maintain morale during their isolated assignments. She included magazines, snacks from home, and occasionally books that soldiers had specifically requested. These personal touches had earned her recognition from the Rangers, who specifically requested her involvement in their supply planning. Staff Sergeant Thompson had once written a note thanking her for including extra batteries for their personal devices, noting that such details made a significant difference in their ability to maintain contact with family back home. The relationship between the main base and its remote outposts was complex, involving careful coordination between multiple departments and constant attention to security protocols. Sarah's role put her at the center of this network, making her one of the few people who had a comprehensive understanding of how all the pieces fit together. She knew which outposts needed additional medical supplies, which teams were running low on ammunition, and which installations had equipment that needed repair or replacement. As the afternoon progressed without contact from Delta, the atmosphere in the command center began to shift subtly. Lieutenant Rodriguez moved from routine attempts to establish communication to more urgent calls, using different frequencies and backup protocols. Major Patricia Wilson, the base operations officer, appeared at the communications station and began reviewing the last known status reports from the outpost. The tension wasn't visible to casual observers, but experienced soldiers could read the signs. Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the communications activity while continuing her inventory work. Her position in the supply depot gave her access to radio chatter from multiple units, and she had developed an intuitive understanding of when routine communications indicated normal operations versus when they suggested developing problems. The increasing frequency of attempted contact with Delta, combined with longer periods of radio silence, created a pattern that her experience told her was concerning. By 1500 hours, the missed communications had escalated from a minor schedule deviation to a potential emergency. Major Wilson had authorized reconnaissance flights to visually check on Outpost Delta, but the mountainous terrain and current weather conditions made immediate aerial observation difficult. The base commander, Colonel James Harrison, had been briefed on the situation and was monitoring developments from the command center. Sarah's understanding of the logistical network made her valuable during this developing crisis. She was asked to provide detailed information about Delta's last resupply, including exact quantities of ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies that had been delivered. Her meticulous record-keeping allowed her to provide precise information about the team's capabilities and limitations. Based on her data, the Rangers should have sufficient supplies to maintain operations for another week, assuming normal consumption rates. However, Sarah also understood that normal consumption assumptions might not apply if the team was facing hostile contact or had been forced to move from their established position. Her knowledge of the Rangers' standard operating procedures, combined with her understanding of their supply situation, led her to recommend that a relief force be prepared to deploy on short notice. Her analysis suggested that while Delta might be operating under communication difficulties, they were probably not in immediate danger of running out of essential supplies. The decision-making process at the command level involved balancing multiple factors that Sarah could observe but not directly influence. Sending a relief force to check on Delta would commit significant resources and potentially expose additional personnel to danger. However, allowing an isolated team to remain out of contact indefinitely was also unacceptable, especially given the increasing intelligence reports about insurgent activity in the region. As evening approached, the base began implementing elevated security measures. Additional sentries were posted, patrols were extended, and all personnel were briefed on the potential for increased threat levels. Sarah found herself working later than usual, ensuring that all supply requests were processed immediately and that critical items were readily available if needed. The sense of routine that had characterized her deployment was gradually being replaced by an awareness that events were developing beyond anyone's complete control. The social dynamics of the base also began to shift as word spread about the missing communications from Delta. Soldiers who had friends among the Rangers expressed concern, while others maintained the professional detachment necessary to continue their own duties effectively. Sarah noticed that conversations became more focused on operational matters and less on personal topics. The usual evening recreational activities continued, but with less enthusiasm and more frequent glances toward the command center. Marcus Rodriguez was working extended shifts in the communications center, attempting to maintain contact with all remote units while coordinating with higher headquarters about the Delta situation. During brief breaks, he would update Sarah on the latest developments, though operational security limited how much information he could share. Their friendship had evolved to include an understanding of each other's professional responsibilities, and Sarah appreciated receiving even limited updates about situations that might affect her supply planning. The missing Rangers represented more than just a communications problem for Sarah. She had developed professional relationships with each team member through their supply interactions, and she felt a personal responsibility for their welfare. Staff Sergeant Thompson had mentioned during their last interaction that his wife was expecting their second child, and that he was hoping to return home in time for the birth. Corporal Kim had requested additional batteries because he was taking an online course during his spare time and needed to keep his tablet charged. These personal connections made the current uncertainty particularly difficult for Sarah to process. As night fell over the base, Sarah completed her shift but found herself reluctant to return to her quarters. The combination of concern for the Delta team and awareness that the base was operating under heightened alert conditions made normal relaxation seem inappropriate. Instead, she remained in the supply depot, using the quiet time to review inventory reports and ensure that everything was properly organized for whatever developments the next day might bring. The night shift operations were different from daytime activities. Fewer personnel were on duty, communication with higher headquarters was limited, and the base took on a more subdued but vigilant character. Sarah could hear the occasional radio chatter from the command center, but without specific details about what was being discussed or planned. The uncertainty was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the situation. Having enough information to understand that something was wrong, but not enough to know what actions were being taken to address it. Sleep came fitfully for most people on the base that night. Sarah found herself lying awake, thinking about the Rangers at Delta and wondering what circumstances might prevent an experienced team from maintaining communication. Her mind ran through various scenarios, from equipment failure to hostile contact, and she considered what supplies might be needed for each possibility. This kind of analytical thinking was her way of managing anxiety, turning uncertainty into logistics problems that she could mentally solve. The next morning brought no improvement in communications with Outpost Delta. The overnight watch had continued attempting to establish contact, using every available frequency and communication protocol, without success. Weather conditions had improved enough to allow aerial reconnaissance, but the initial flights had been unable to locate any signs of the Rangers or their equipment at the known coordinates for their position. Colonel Harrison convened a meeting of department heads to discuss response options. Sarah was included in this meeting because of her detailed knowledge of Delta's supply situation and her understanding of the logistical requirements for potential relief operations. Her presence in these high-level discussions reflected the recognition that her role as supply coordinator provided critical information for operational planning. During the briefing, Sarah learned that intelligence reports indicated possible insurgent activity in the area around Outpost Delta. Intercepted communications suggested that hostile forces might be planning coordinated operations against coalition positions, though specific targets and timing remained unclear. This information added urgency to the need to locate the missing Rangers, while also raising concerns about committing additional forces to potentially dangerous areas. The attack began at 0623 hours on a Tuesday morning that had started with the deceptive calm of routine. Sarah was in the supply depot, conducting her regular morning inventory check, when the first mortar rounds impacted the southeastern perimeter of the base. The explosions were close enough to rattle the storage containers and knock several boxes of medical supplies off their carefully arranged shelves. For a moment that stretched impossibly long, Sarah's mind struggled to process what was happening, her experience filing the sounds under scheduled demolition, before reality crashed through her denial. The base alarm system activated immediately, its piercing wail cutting through the mountain air and galvanizing everyone into emergency response mode. Sarah's training took over before her conscious mind had fully processed the situation, and she found herself securing sensitive equipment and checking that communication devices were functioning. The months of drills and preparation had created automatic responses that served her well when thinking became secondary to surviving. Outside the supply depot, Sarah could hear the organized chaos of a base under attack. Commands were being shouted, vehicles were starting, and the distinctive crack of small arms fire was beginning to mix with the deeper thump of mortar explosions. Through the small window of her workspace, she could see soldiers moving with the purposeful urgency that marked the difference between training exercises and actual combat. Everything she had practiced was now real, and the stakes had escalated from theoretical to life and death in the span of seconds. Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio system, providing updates on the developing situation. Multiple mortar positions had been identified in the surrounding mountains, and small arms fire was coming from at least 3 different directions. The enemy force was larger and better coordinated than typical attacks, suggesting significant planning and preparation. Most concerning was the indication that the attackers knew the base's defensive positions and vulnerabilities, implying either extensive surveillance or inside information. The missing Rangers from Outpost Delta suddenly took on new significance as Sarah realized their disappearance was likely connected to this coordinated attack. The enemy had probably eliminated or neutralized the early warning post as part of their preparation, giving them freedom to position forces and prepare for a major assault. The relief patrol that had been scheduled to investigate Delta's silence was now trapped on the base, their mission transformed from rescue to defense. Sarah's immediate responsibility was to ensure that ammunition and medical supplies could be distributed to defensive positions as needed. She began organizing supplies into portable packages that could be quickly moved to wherever they were most needed. Her familiarity with the base layout and defensive positions, gained through months of routine supply deliveries, now proved invaluable as she anticipated which locations would require additional support. The base's defensive plan relied on interlocking fields of fire from prepared positions around the perimeter, supported by mortar teams and heavy weapons. However, the enemy's apparent knowledge of these positions meant that the defenders were facing an opponent who had studied their tactics and prepared countermeasures. The usual advantages of defensive fighting were partially neutralized by the enemy's intelligence and coordination. As the attack intensified, Sarah received requests for additional ammunition from multiple defensive positions. The volume and urgency of these requests indicated that the fighting was more intense than any previous contact the base had experienced. She worked methodically to fill each request, maintaining her customary attention to detail even as explosions continued to impact around the base. Her calm efficiency in the midst of chaos helped maintain the supply lines that were critical to the base's defense. Major Wilson appeared at the supply depot 20 minutes into the attack, her uniform already showing signs of the dust and stress of combat operations. She needed immediate access to emergency medical supplies and additional communication equipment, as several defensive positions had suffered casualties and equipment damage. Sarah's organization of the medical supplies allowed Wilson to gather what was needed quickly, but the Major's grim expression indicated that the situation was more serious than the radio communications had conveyed. The sound signature of the battle was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during training exercises. Real bullets made different sounds than blank ammunition. Explosions carried the sharp smell of cordite and dust, and the shouts of soldiers carried an edge of urgency that was impossible to simulate. Her body responded to these stimuli with a heightened awareness that made everything seem simultaneously crystal clear and surreal. Through her radio monitoring, Sarah learned that the base was surrounded by enemy forces numbering at least 50 fighters, significantly more than the intelligence estimates had predicted. The attackers were using tactics and equipment that indicated training and organization beyond the typical insurgent groups the base had previously encountered. This was not a random attack, but a carefully planned operation designed to inflict maximum damage on coalition forces in the region. The base commander had requested immediate air support, But weather conditions and the distance to available aircraft meant that help was at least 45 minutes away. The defenders would have to hold their positions using only their organic weapons and the supplies they had on hand. Sarah's role in ensuring adequate ammunition supplies suddenly became critical to the survival of everyone on the base. As she continued organizing and distributing supplies, Sarah became aware that her location in the supply depot provided an unexpected tactical advantage. The building's position gave her clear sight lines to several approaches that the enemy might use to infiltrate the base perimeter. She had never considered this aspect of her workplace before, but as she watched enemy fighters attempting to advance through the terrain she had observed daily for months, she realized she had developed an intimate knowledge of the surrounding area that could prove valuable. The request that would change everything came at 0711 hours when Sergeant Williams burst into the supply depot with blood on her uniform and desperation in her voice. 3 defensive positions on the eastern perimeter were running critically low on ammunition, and the usual supply routes were under direct enemy fire. Someone needed to provide covering fire from an elevated position while ammunition was moved to the threatened positions. The someone available was Sarah, and the elevated position was the roof of the supply depot. Sarah's initial response was to suggest alternatives, to find someone more qualified for what seemed like a job for a trained marksman rather than a supply coordinator. But Sergeant Williams cut through her protests with the brutal arithmetic of combat. There was no one else available, and the eastern perimeter would be overrun without immediate support. The soldiers defending those positions were people Sarah knew personally, soldiers whose supply requests she had filled, whose personal stories she had listened to during quiet moments on the base. The weapon available was an M14 rifle with a scope, part of the special equipment inventory that Sarah maintained but had never expected to use. The rifle was intended for designated marksmen, soldiers with specialized training in long-range shooting, but it was the only weapon available that could provide effective fire at the ranges needed. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she checked the weapon's condition and loaded the 20-round magazine, her mind racing through half-remembered training sessions that had seemed academic at the time. Climbing to the roof of the supply depot required Sarah to move through areas of the base that were under sporadic enemy fire. The journey from her familiar workspace to the exposed rooftop position marked a physical and psychological transition from her role as a support soldier to an active combatant. Each step up the ladder to the roof took her further from everything she understood about her place in the military and closer to a test of abilities she had never seriously considered. The view from the rooftop was both spectacular and terrifying. Sarah could see the entire base laid out below her, with defensive positions marked by muzzle flashes and the movement of soldiers between covered positions. Beyond the perimeter, she could identify enemy positions by their muzzle flashes and the movement of figures among the rocks and vegetation. The scope on the M14 brought these distant targets into sharp focus, making the abstract concept of enemy fighters into specific individuals whose actions threatened the people she had come to consider family. The first target Sarah identified was an enemy fighter approximately 400 meters away, positioned behind a large boulder and directing fire toward the eastern defensive positions. Through the scope, she could see him clearly. Young, bearded, wearing the mixed military and civilian clothing typical of insurgent fighters. He was methodically firing single shots at the base perimeter, his position well chosen to provide cover while maintaining clear fields of fire. Sarah's training on the rifle range had been conducted under controlled conditions with paper targets at known distances. The current situation involved estimating range, compensating for wind, and accounting for the stress of actual combat. She had to translate theoretical knowledge into practical skill while under pressure, with lives depending on her accuracy. The steady hands that had served her well in inventory management now had to prove themselves in a completely different context. The mechanics of the shot required Sarah to control her breathe intensity of combat, had a way of compressing time and expanding awareness simultaneously. From her position on the rooftop, Sarah found herself operating in a bubble of hyper-focused concentration where every detail of the surrounding battlefield became crystal clear while the broader context of time and consequence faded into background noise. The scope of the M14 rifle became her window into a deadly chess match, where each move carried the weight of human lives. Her fourth shot eliminated an enemy machine gunner who had been systematically targeting the base's communication equipment. Sarah had observed his pattern, short bursts aimed at specific targets rather than random suppressive fire, and realized he was trying to isolate the base by destroying their ability to call for reinforcements. The technical understanding she had developed of communication equipment allowed her to recognize the tactical significance of his targeting, and her shot prevented the loss of critical capabilities that the defenders couldn't afford to lose. The precision required for effective shooting at these distances was something Sarah had never fully appreciated during her basic marksmanship training. Every variable, wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, the angle of her position relative to the target, affected bullet trajectory in ways that required constant adjustment and recalculation. Her mind, trained through months of managing complex supply equations, adapted to these ballistic calculations with surprising facility. Between shots, Sarah maintained situational awareness of the broader battle developing around the base. Radio chatter provided updates on ammunition status, casualty reports, and the movement of enemy forces. The picture that emerged was of a well-coordinated attack designed to overwhelm the base's defenses through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. The enemy had clearly studied the defensive layout and identified key vulnerabilities that they were systematically exploiting. Her fifth and sixth shots came in rapid succession as she identified a two-man enemy team attempting to maneuver a rocket-propelled grenade launcher into position to target the base's motor pool. The destruction of the vehicles would trap the defenders and prevent any possibility of evacuation if the perimeter was breached. Sarah's shots eliminated both operators before they could complete their setup, the second man falling as he reached for the weapon his partner had dropped. The psychological impact of taking human lives was something that Sarah's training had covered theoretically, but the reality was both more immediate and less overwhelming than she had expected. Each enemy fighter she engaged was threatening people she cared about, and the moral calculus was simplified by the clarity of the defensive situation. She was not an aggressor or invader. She was protecting her home and family, even if that home was a military base, and that family consisted of fellow soldiers. The seventh shot was perhaps the most technically challenging, targeting an enemy sniper who had taken position in a damaged building approximately 600 meters from the base. The target was partially concealed and shooting from a prepared position, making detection difficult and accurate engagement even more demanding. Sarah had to wait for the enemy sniper to expose himself while firing, then quickly acquire and engage the target before he could return to cover. The patience required for this shot was similar to the methodical persistence she applied to tracking down missing inventory items. Major Wilson's voice came over the radio with an update that changed Sarah's understanding of the broader tactical situation. Intelligence intercepts indicated that the attack on the base was part of a larger operation targeting multiple coalition installations throughout the region. The missing Rangers from Outpost Delta had apparently stumbled onto the preparation for this coordinated assault, explaining their sudden disappearance and the enemy's detailed knowledge of the base's defenses. This information added urgency to the defense of the base, as it was now clear that reinforcements might be delayed or unavailable due to simultaneous attacks elsewhere. The defenders would have to rely entirely on their own resources and capabilities, making every successful shot Sarah fired more critical to their survival. The base's ability to maintain communications and call in air support could determine whether similar attacks on other positions would succeed or fail. Sarah's eighth shot targeted an enemy communications operator who was coordinating the various attacking elements. Through her scope, she had observed him moving between different positions, apparently relaying instructions and coordinating the timing of various assault elements. Eliminating this individual disrupted the enemy's command and control, causing their attacks to become less coordinated and more predictable. The physical demands of sustained precision shooting were beginning to affect Sarah's performance. The M14 rifle was heavier than the weapons she was accustomed to handling, and maintaining steady shooting positions for extended periods required core strength and endurance that her supply duties had not developed. Her hands were beginning to shake slightly from fatigue, and she had to consciously control her breathing to maintain accuracy. Despite the physical challenges, Sarah's shooting had entered a rhythm that felt almost meditative. The process of identifying targets, calculating firing solutions, and executing shots had become automatic, allowing her conscious mind to maintain broader situational awareness while her trained reflexes handled the mechanics of marksmanship. This mental state was similar to the zone she sometimes entered during complex inventory reconciliations, where the details of the work became intuitive while her strategic thinking focused on larger patterns and priorities. The ninth shot was a longer-range engagement against an enemy mortar team that had been adjusting their fire to target specific buildings within the base. Sarah had observed their process of firing, observing impact points, adjusting elevation, and firing again. By tracking their pattern, she was able to predict when team members would be exposed during the loading and aiming process. Her shot eliminated the gunner at the moment when he was most vulnerable, effectively silencing the mortar position. Radio communications from the perimeter defensive positions indicated that the intensity of enemy fire was decreasing noticeably. Several previously active enemy positions had gone silent, and the coordinated nature of the attacks was breaking down into smaller, less effective individual actions. Sergeant Williams reported that ammunition resupply to the eastern perimeter positions had been completed successfully, and those positions were now stable and effective. The transformation in the tactical situation was largely due to Sarah's intervention, though she was focused on immediate targets rather than the broader strategic impact of her actions. Each shot she fired removed a threat to the base, but the cumulative effect was to disrupt the enemy's entire offensive plan. The attacking force had planned for resistance from the base's defensive positions, but they had not anticipated effective long-range fire from an unexpected position. Sarah's 10th shot was against an enemy leader who had been attempting to rally his scattered forces for another coordinated assault. Through the scope, she could see him moving between different groups of fighters, pointing toward the base and apparently giving instructions. His body language and the response of the other fighters indicated his importance to their operations. When he fell, the remaining enemy fighters began to show signs of confusion and loss of direction. The final shot, number 11, was almost anticlimactic. A single enemy fighter remained in an advanced position, continuing to fire sporadically at the base perimeter despite the collapse of the organized attack around him. Sarah's shot ended his resistance, and for the first time in over 2 hours, the base perimeter fell silent except for the occasional distant sound of enemy forces withdrawing through the mountains. The sudden quiet was almost disorienting after the sustained intensity of combat. Sarah remained in position on the rooftop, scanning for additional targets, but the enemy withdrawal appeared to be genuine and comprehensive. Radio chatter from the perimeter positions confirmed that hostile fire had ceased, and patrols were being organized to ensure that the immediate threat had been eliminated. As the immediate danger passed, Sarah became aware of the physical and emotional toll the engagement had taken. Her hands were shaking from fatigue and adrenaline, her throat was dry from the stress of sustained concentration, and her shoulders ached from maintaining shooting positions. The M14 rifle that had felt manageable at the beginning of the engagement now seemed impossibly heavy, and she had to consciously focus on maintaining safe handling procedures. The radio crackled with Colonel Harrison's voice, requesting a situation report from all defensive positions. As each position reported in with casualty figures and ammunition status, a picture emerged of a successful defense that had cost the base far fewer casualties than anyone had expected given the intensity and coordination of the attack. The eastern perimeter positions that Sarah had directly supported reported no additional casualties after her intervention began. Major Wilson appeared on the rooftop as Sarah was preparing to climb down, her expression mixing relief, gratitude, and something approaching awe. The Major had been monitoring radio communications throughout the engagement and understood better than most people how critical Sarah's intervention had been to the successful defense. Her first words were not about tactics or regulations, but a simple human acknowledgement of what Sarah had accomplished. The aftermath of combat brought its own challenges as Sarah had to transition from the focused clarity of engagement back to the complex emotions and considerations of normal human interaction. The 11 enemy fighters she had killed were no longer immediate threats, but they had been human beings with families and motivations that she would never understand. The moral weight of taking lives, temporarily set aside during the urgency of combat, began to reassert itself as the immediate danger passed. The hours immediately following the successful defense of the base passed in a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and hypervigilance that characterized the aftermath of intense combat. Sarah found herself back in the supply depot, mechanically checking inventory levels and processing requests for ammunition replacement. But her hands continued to shake slightly from residual adrenaline, and every sudden sound caused her to look toward the windows with an alertness that hadn't existed before the attack. The base medic, Doc Martinez, insisted on examining everyone who had been directly involved in the fighting, and Sarah submitted to his assessment with the same methodical cooperation she brought to all her duties. He found elevated heart rate and blood pressure consistent with combat stress, minor dehydration, and muscle tension from the sustained shooting positions, but no injuries requiring treatment. What he couldn't measure was the psychological transformation that had occurred on the rooftop, the way her understanding of herself and her capabilities had been permanently altered by the morning's events. Lieutenant Rodriguez appeared at the supply depot 3 hours after the attack had ended, his usually cheerful demeanor subdued by the reality of having coordinated defensive communications while under enemy fire. He had monitored Sarah's radio communications throughout the engagement and understood perhaps better than anyone how critical her intervention had been to the base's survival. Their friendship now carried the additional weight of shared combat experience, a bond that would connect them long after their deployment ended. The official debriefing process began that afternoon, with Colonel Harrison personally conducting Sarah's after-action interview. The colonel was a career infantry officer who had participated in multiple deployments and numerous combat engagements, but he had never encountered a situation where a supply coordinator had provided decisive long-range fire support during a major enemy assault. His questions were thorough and professional, but Sarah could detect an undertone of amazement at the circumstances he was documenting. Sarah's account of the engagement was characteristically precise and detailed, reflecting the same attention to specifics that made her excellent at inventory management. She described each shot, the reasoning behind target selection, and the tactical considerations that had guided her actions. What she couldn't adequately convey was the mental transformation that had occurred, the way her civilian analytical mindset had seamlessly integrated with military training to create effective combat performance under extreme pressure. The intelligence analysis that followed revealed the true scope of what the base had faced and what Sarah's intervention had prevented. The attacking force had numbered at least 60 fighters, significantly larger than initial estimates, and had been equipped with weapons and communication equipment indicating substantial external support. The coordination of the attack suggested months of planning and detailed intelligence gathering about the base's vulnerabilities and defensive capabilities. Most significantly, intercepted communications revealed that the attack on Sarah's base had been part of a coordinated offensive targeting multiple coalition installations throughout the region. The success or failure of each individual attack would influence the enemy's ability to claim a major propaganda victory and potentially alter the strategic balance in the area. Sarah's 11 shots had contributed to denying the enemy a significant military and political success. The search and rescue mission that finally reached Outpost Delta discovered the fate of the missing Rangers and provided crucial context for understanding the enemy's capabilities and intentions. The 6 Rangers had not been killed or captured as initially feared, but had been conducting a running battle with enemy scouts for 3 days while attempting to return to the main base with intelligence about the planned coordinated attacks. Their radio silence had been necessary to avoid revealing their position to the pursuing enemy forces. Staff Sergeant Thompson and his team had observed the enemy's preparation activities and understood the scope of the planned attacks, but their attempts to warn the main base had been prevented by the enemy's aggressive pursuit. When they finally reached friendly lines 2 days after the base attack. Their intelligence confirmed that Sarah's base had faced the most serious threat, and that the successful defense had disrupted the enemy's entire operational plan for the region. The personal impact on Sarah of having killed 11 enemy fighters was complex and evolved over the days and weeks following the engagement. The immediate emotional response had been relief and satisfaction at having protected her fellow soldiers. But as time passed and the adrenaline subsided, she began to process the moral and psychological weight of having taken human lives. The base chaplain, Captain Johnson, made himself available for counseling, and Sarah found their conversations helpful in working through the complex emotions surrounding her actions. The military's formal recognition of Sarah's performance came through multiple channels, beginning with Colonel Harrison's recommendation for a Bronze Star with V device for valor. The citation would note her decisive intervention during a critical phase of the base defense, her effective elimination of key enemy personnel, and her contribution to the successful protection of coalition forces and facilities. The award process would take months to complete, but the recognition was immediate and sincere. More meaningful to Sarah than formal awards was the response of her fellow soldiers, particularly those whose lives had been directly protected by her actions. The Rangers from the eastern perimeter positions made a point of thanking her personally, and their expressions of gratitude carried the weight of men who understood how close they had come to being overrun. Sergeant Williams, who had first asked Sarah to provide covering fire, became one of her strongest advocates for recognition and subsequent military career opportunities. The transformation in Sarah's role and responsibilities within the base was immediate and significant. Her demonstrated competence under extreme conditions led to her inclusion in tactical planning discussions, training programs for other supply personnel, and liaison duties with special operations units that required detailed logistical support. The Quiet Supply Coordinator had become a recognized military professional whose opinions carried weight in operational planning. However, Sarah found herself struggling with the sudden change in how others perceived her and interacted with her. The same soldiers who had previously seen her primarily as an efficient clerk now treated her with a deference that felt uncomfortable and unearned. She had not changed as a person. She was still the methodical, service-oriented individual who took pride in attention to detail. But others' perceptions of her capabilities and potential had been permanently altered by her combat performance. The strategic implications of Sarah's story extended far beyond the immediate tactical success of defending the base. Military leaders throughout the region began reassessing their understanding of the combat potential of soldiers in support roles, leading to enhanced training programs and revised deployment policies. Sarah's example demonstrated that the traditional distinctions between combat and support personnel might be less absolute than previously assumed. The enemy's response to their failed coordinated offensive included a significant change in tactics and strategy for the region. Intelligence reports indicated that the loss of key personnel and the failure to achieve their strategic objectives had forced them to abandon their plans for additional large-scale attacks. Sarah's contribution to this broader strategic outcome was recognized at levels far above her own unit and base, though much of this recognition remained classified for operational security reasons. As news of the engagement spread through military channels, Sarah found herself contacted by journalists, military historians, and training development personnel who wanted to understand and document her experience. She approached these interactions with the same methodical professionalism she brought to all her duties. But she was careful to emphasize that her success had been the result of good training, teamwork, and circumstance rather than individual heroism. The question of Sarah's future military career became a topic of discussion among her commanders and personnel specialists. Her demonstrated capabilities suggested potential for advanced training and positions that would make full use of her analytical skills and proven performance under pressure. However, Sarah herself remained focused on completing her current deployment successfully and returning home to help her family's restaurant, as she had originally planned. The psychological adjustment to having killed 11 people in combat was an ongoing process that required conscious effort and professional support. Sarah found that talking with other soldiers who had similar experiences was helpful, and she developed relationships with veterans of previous deployments who could provide perspective on the long-term emotional challenges of combat service. The base's mental health resources were adequate for immediate needs, but Sarah understood that processing these experiences would be a lifelong journey. The broader implications of Sarah's story for military training and personnel policies were still being developed months after the engagement. Her experience suggested that supply coordinators and other support personnel might benefit from more advanced combat training, that individual initiative and analytical thinking were as important as traditional military skills, and that the potential for ordinary soldiers to perform extraordinarily should not be underestimated. The letters Sarah wrote to her family about her experiences were carefully crafted to convey the significant developments in her military service without causing unnecessary worry or revealing classified information. Her parents' responses reflected pride in her achievements, concern for her safety, and curiosity about how their quiet, studious daughter had discovered such capabilities. The restaurant that had been struggling when Sarah enlisted was now thriving, partly due to her financial support and partly due to the publicity that came with having a war hero in the family. As her deployment neared its end, Sarah reflected on how completely her understanding of herself and her capabilities had changed. The supply coordinator who had enlisted primarily for financial reasons had discovered leadership abilities, technical skills, and personal courage that she had never suspected. The experience had not only proven her competence under extreme conditions, but had revealed character strengths that would serve her well in whatever career path she ultimately chose. The morning that had started with routine inventory checks and ended with Sarah Chun becoming a legend had demonstrated that heroism often emerged from ordinary people performing ordinary duties with extraordinary dedication and skill. Her 11 perfect shots had saved lives, altered the strategic balance in her region, and created a story that would inspire military personnel for generations. But, perhaps most importantly, they had shown Sarah herself that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The supply coordinator who had worried about spreadsheets and coffee supplies had become a combat veteran whose quick thinking and steady hands had changed the course of a battle. As she prepared to return home to her family's restaurant and civilian life, Sarah Chun carried with her not just the satisfaction of duty well performed, but the knowledge that she had discovered capabilities within herself that would serve her well in whatever challenges life might present. The echo of those 11 shots would resonate through her life and the lives of everyone whose story had intersected with hers on that extraordinary morning in the mountains of Afghanistan. However, the broader context provided clear justification for Sarah's actions. The base intelligence officer's preliminary assessment indicated that the attacking force had been significantly larger and better organized than any previous threat the base had faced. Without effective long-range fire to disrupt their coordination and eliminate key personnel, the assault might have succeeded in breaching the perimeter and causing massive casualties among the defenders. As Sarah climbed down from the rooftop that had become her temporary battlefield, she was no longer the same person who had climbed up 2 hours earlier. The supply coordinator who had spent months ensuring that other soldiers had what they needed for combat had discovered her own capacity for warfare. The quiet efficiency that had characterized her support role had proven equally valuable in direct combat, and the attention to detail that made her excellent at inventory management had translated into deadly accuracy with a rifle. The transformation was not just personal, but would have lasting implications for how the military understood the potential capabilities of soldiers in support roles. Sarah's performance would be analyzed, studied, and used as an example of how ordinary soldiers could rise to extraordinary challenges when circumstances demanded. But, for the moment, as she made her way back to the supply depot that had been her battlefield command post, she was simply a soldier who had done what was necessary to protect her fellow troops. The 11 perfect shots that had helped save the base would become the foundation of a story that would be told and retold throughout the military community. But Sarah Chun, supply coordinator turned combat hero, was already thinking about the supply reports that would need to be completed, the inventory that would need to be reconciled, and the routine duties that would resume once the immediate crisis had passed. Heroes, she was beginning to understand, often looked remarkably like ordinary people who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills. Thing, align the crosshairs, and squeeze the triggers smoothly while maintaining sight picture. These basic marksmanship principles had been drilled into her during training, but executing them while under enemy fire and with the knowledge that missing meant people would die added layers of complexity she had never imagined. Her first shot missed, the bullet impacting the rock face several inches from the target. The miss was actually valuable feedback, allowing Sarah to adjust her aim based on where the bullet had struck. Her second shot was closer, and her third shot found its mark. The enemy fighter dropped behind his cover, and his position stopped producing fire toward the base perimeter. Sarah had just killed another human being, but the immediate emotion was not horror or regret. It was relief that the threat to her fellow soldiers had been eliminated. The success of her first engagement gave Sarah confidence and established a pattern for what would follow. She began systematically identifying enemy positions that were threatening the base perimeter and engaging each target with careful, deliberate shots. Her natural methodical approach, developed through months of careful inventory management, translated surprisingly well to the deliberate precision required for effective marksmanship. The radio chatter from the base defensive positions began to reflect the impact of Sarah's fire. Reports indicated that enemy pressure on the eastern perimeter was decreasing, and ammunition was successfully being moved to threatened positions. Sergeant Williams' voice came over the radio with updates on the tactical situation, and Sarah could hear the relief in her tone as the immediate crisis began to stabilize. As the engagement continued, Sarah found herself entering a mental state that was completely focused on the immediate task of identifying threats and eliminating them. The complex emotions and considerations that normally occupied her thoughts were set aside in favor of the simple clarity of protecting the soldiers she served alongside. Each shot was a problem to be solved, involving calculations of distance, wind, and target movement that engaged the same analytical skills she used in her regular duties. The transformation taking place on that rooftop was not just about Sarah's ability to use a rifle effectively. She was discovering that the qualities that made her an excellent supply coordinator, attention to detail, ability to remain calm under pressure, and systematic approach to problem solving, were also the qualities that could make her effective in combat. The quiet efficiency that had characterized her support role was proving valuable in a completely different context. The battle for the base would continue for several more hours, but Sarah's intervention at a critical moment had prevented the breakthrough that could have led to the collapse of the entire defense. As she continued to engage targets from her rooftop position, she had no way of knowing that she was creating a legend that would be told and retold throughout the military community. The supply coordinator, who had never thought of herself as a warrior, was writing a new chapter in the story of what ordinary soldiers could accomplish under extraordinary circumstances. The decision was made to organize a ground patrol to physically investigate the Delta position. The patrol would include experienced rangers, a medic, and a communications specialist, with helicopter support available if needed. Sarah's role would be to ensure that the patrol was properly supplied for extended operations, including additional medical supplies and extra ammunition. The mission was scheduled to depart early the following morning, giving everyone overnight to complete preparations. As Sarah worked through the supply requirements for the relief patrol, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with supporting operations where lives depended on her accuracy and thoroughness. Every item she included or omitted could potentially affect the success of the mission and the safety of the soldiers involved. Her earlier experience with routine supply runs had prepared her for this level of responsibility, but the current circumstances made every decision feel more consequential. The evening before the patrol's departure, Sarah completed final checks of all equipment and supplies. She had included extra batteries for communication equipment, additional medical supplies for treating casualties, and supplemental ammunition beyond standard loadouts. Her preparation was thorough and methodical, reflecting both her training and her personal commitment to ensuring that the soldiers she supported had everything they needed to complete their mission safely. Unknown to Sarah and everyone else at the base, the Rangers from Outpost Delta were not dead or captured, but were engaged in a desperate game of hide-and-seek with a much larger insurgent force that had surrounded their position. Staff Sergeant Thompson had made the decision to abandon their fixed position and move to alternate locations when it became clear that they were being observed and tracked. The team was maintaining radio silence to avoid revealing their new positions, but they were running low on ammunition and water. The insurgents who had located Delta were part of a larger operation that included plans to attack the main base and other coalition positions throughout the valley. The Rangers' mission to observe and report had inadvertently placed them in position to witness the enemy's preparation activities. Their ability to remain hidden while gathering intelligence about insurgent plans was crucial to the safety of hundreds of coalition soldiers, but their isolation made it impossible to communicate this information without revealing their location. As Sarah settled into an uneasy sleep on her final night before everything changed, she had no way of knowing that the relief patrol would never reach Outpost Delta, that the missing Rangers were closer to the base than anyone realized, and that her own carefully organized world was about to be shattered by the sound of gunfire echoing through the mountains. The supply coordinator who had spent months ensuring that others had what they needed for combat was about to discover what she herself was capable of when every comfortable assumption about her role and abilities was stripped away by the harsh reality of war. The morning that would change everything had begun with routine supply requests and normal radio chatter. Sarah had processed the usual requests for ammunition, food, and medical supplies. She had coordinated with transport units about delivery schedules and had updated her inventory tracking systems. Everything seemed normal, just another day in what had become her temporary but familiar world. As she worked through her morning tasks, Sarah had no way of knowing that insurgent forces had been watching the base for weeks, studying patrol patterns, and planning a coordinated attack that would test every person stationed there. She couldn't know that the routine supply run she had helped organize would become the trigger for events that would demand everything she had learned about herself and everything she thought she knew about her own capabilities. The transformation from supply coordinator to combat soldier would happen in moments, but the foundation for that transformation had been building throughout her deployment, through every interaction with fellow soldiers, every careful attention to detail, and every moment of growing confidence in her ability to handle whatever challenges arose. Sarah Chun was about to discover what she was truly capable of when everything familiar disappeared and only instinct and training remained.